It will always remain a mystery to me why I was accorded the privilege of coming to speak to you in the memory of the redoubtable Shri K. Jayashankar. I've had no role in the making of Telangana. I am not an academic or an activist or a public intellectual. I do not and have not occupied or ever aspired for high public office. I lived the rather humdrum life of a retired civil servant, and my modest accomplishments during my career in administration are precisely that, modest. All I have is a past where I did not always conform to stereotype and try to use my modest workspace to think and do things differently, cultivate a kind of continuous subversiveness so that received and accepted wisdom would always be questioned, intellectual flatulence punctured, and the opportunity to make creative use of one's position be used to the full. So that's all I had. I know very little of Telangana and its history, so I speak to you with dangerously little knowledge. What fascinates me, however, about Telangana and the movement for the Telangana state is the unique dimension that it adds to Indian federalism. I'm a committed federalist. I'm also a committed anarchist in the sense I hate the state. Having worked in the state for 40 years, you have come to accept we hate the state. So the creation of Indian states through the States Reorganization Commission had in it a streak of bureaucratic thinking in that it wanted to identify a hegemonic strand which linked communities to a particular geography and honed in on language as the most appropriate way of defining regional identities and giving these identities political expression. Now, ethno-linguistic identities are important, but in the extraordinary tapestry of Indian diversity, language is one of these identities. It's just one of the very multiple identities, both in a region or even an individual or in an individual. And giving any of these identities the primacy and giving it hegemony and treating it as hierarchically superior to other identities is always something which has in it the seeds of division and discord. So forcing a Telugu identity onto the people of Telangana would always have been problematic. Adding to the problem was to treat a homogenized Telugu culture as something superior to a culture born out of a shared history of agroecological resistance, which simultaneously incorporated elements of a rich, courtly, urban, cosmopolitan culture brought in by the Nizam. So the fact that the Telangana movement has successfully reasserted this complex and rich cultural identity and given it political expression is a tribute to its resilience as well as its tenacity. And I wish to begin by conveying to the people of Telangana my full-throated appreciation of their historic success. The creation of Telangana has enriched and deepened Indian federal impulses. Ancestrally, I belong to Uttarakhand. Although that's my Janma Bhumi, although my Karma Bhumi was Punjab and then Delhi. And there are many similarities, many parallels between the movement of the Uttarakhand state and the Telangana movement. The Uttarakhand movement is in fact an older movement than even the Telangana movement and started at the time of British rule. In fact, there is a demand for a separate Uttarakhand state made to the British authorities. Uttarakhand too was a state born out of a strong movement for the assertion of a regional identity, which was driven by a powerful people's ecological and environmental agenda. It too had a unique history with a culture born out of an intimate man-mountain relationship, a history of small, self-governing yet fully networked communities which sustainably managed their unique natural resources. Uttarakhand has one of the oldest history of community management of natural resources. It had the system of one panchayats and pani panchayats thousands of years ago. So this unique history of engagement with the management of natural resources and with the pursuit of spirituality and philosophy for thousands of years is what gave Uttarakhand communities an extraordinary commitment to the values of pursuit of truth and non-violence. Uttarakhand movement was always led by a Gandhian spirit, and most of the Chipko movement you might have heard about was very much a Gandhian movement led by women. And I'll come to that later also. Now, the imposition of the Hindi heartland UP identity onto this unique culture was always an act of bureaucratic barbarism, and therefore it was bound to be resisted. So similar to the Telangana movement, that's where I find close parallels here, that kind of bureaucratic barbarism, I call it. Uttarakhand too was born out of a long and cathartic socio-political cultural struggle. Now, the reason for my comparing the Uttarakhand experience with that of Telangana is not just to highlight the parallels. It is to sound a warning. 14 years ago, when Uttarakhand came into being, the euphoria and the excitement of making a new beginning was immense. We were all extraordinarily excited. We thought that we had really, even though I was still in the government, but I had been, in a personal capacity, been closely involved with many of the people who led the Chipko Andolan as well as the Uttarakhand movement. So we all believed that a new state was going to give expression to this rich struggle and chart out a radically different course of the way people are governed, of the way policies and programs and interventions are planned and implemented, of the way communities are empowered, and the role that women are accorded to in governance and in the management of natural resources, and how science and technology is harnessed to provide is harnessed to empower communities to take their own decision. But in just 14 years, these dreams lie shattered. Today, Uttarakhand has become yet another arena for power games of various mafia groups who have gained control of the state's abundant natural resources for extraordinary self-aggrandizement through blatant rent-seeking and cronyism. In the process, the very strong traditions of community self-governance which Uttarakhand had for many centuries have been eroded and replaced by a rent-seeking, rapacious and unscrupulous oligarchy. The contractor Babu Neta nexus has a vice-like grip on the political economy of the state, and in the name of development, what we have seen is a manic frenzy of construction activities, dams, roads, urban complexes, tourism infrastructure of extraordinary ugliness, the wanton destruction of natural forests, the depletion and pollution of rivers, lakes and natural wellsprings, and the unchecked motorization of transport. There are times when it seems that Uttarakhand was better off as a neglected and backward part of UP than as a state which has development as its principal agenda. This kind of perverse growth in the name of development is inevitable when development is something which governments do for the people and not what the people do for themselves. Today, one of the biggest businesses in India is the business of poverty. The frightening reality is that the Indian state today survives and sustains itself on poverty as an industry. And this industry needs the poor as a market for selling its products and services. While a small shrinking of the market through some incidental trickle-down effect could be tolerated, any genuine reform which can catapult the growth rate or ensure a more direct redistribution of wealth will never be permitted. Indian politics today revolves around the state and the unprecedented rent-seeking opportunities that open up when one captures state power. The size of this rent economy is mind-boggling, and while some part of this economy needs real economic growth, leads to some real economic growth in infrastructure industry for the continued generation of certain kinds of rent, the largest chunk is still constituted by the poverty business. The business is not limited to just visible poverty alleviation programs, but to a range of activities and state interventions taken in the name of poor, sustaining bewildering varieties of subsidies, food, fertilizer, energy being only a few, creating poor infrastructure for the poor, and extending or reaffirming control over scarce resources and scarce commodities for ostensibly redistributive social and or national purposes. Politics, the poverty business and the politics of poverty are both insidious and perverse. Perverse because even genuine, well-meaning intentions get converted into the most devious stratagems for extracting rent, disempowering the poor, and conserving them in a state of poverty. Insidious because the politics of poverty uses the rhetoric of social justice to disguise its true intent. So paradoxically, the biggest danger for Telangana comes from the very creation of the state itself. Because the Indian state today is a predatory animal which can outgrow its utility in the twinkling of an eye. The state apparatus which we inherited at independence was to begin with overdeveloped in relation to the development of classes in society, and has subsequently grown not just independent of classes but as a class by itself, in that its interests, its ideology, its network of connections, its way of working can be differentiated from other classes in civil society. In fact, it is almost a universe in itself, with its own processes of accumulation and its own processes of legitimation, its own economy and its own contradiction. This universe consists not only of politicians and the bureaucracy, but a vast group of contractors, traders, touts, mafiosi groups, academics and activists and business empires built around state monopolies. They derive their businesses from the state, and their lives are inextricably intertwined with the state and the use of state power in thousands of different ways. Land and real estate, mining, trading in timber, food grain, diesel and kerosene, alcohol, government civil works contracts, rural infrastructure creation, for example, are just some of the gigantic businesses derived from the state which dominate our rent economy. Now, without going into the details of how this perverse form of capitalism thrives through its nexus with the state, I simply want to highlight the manner in which it reduces all politics to real politics, in a way that the underlying text of any political issue, such as the creation of a new state, is a subtext of greed, venality, and hard-nosed political horse trading. So the ostensible differences between political parties in philosophy, ideology, principles, and values are completely hypocritical and opportunistic and meant only to mask the intense competition for gaining control over state power. Most political battles, thus, are only a kind of charade played out to keep alive the pretense of differences in principles and values to be able to retain the loyalties and the votes of their specific constituencies. And these ostensible political differences can be happily forgotten and abandoned when it comes to the actual exercise of state power. Alliances between different political groupings can be formed and reformed, changed and shuffled around with insuperable ease, because everyone in the game what the real issues are. So how do we prevent Telangana from going the way of all other Indian states? The temptation to reproduce the same hierarchical structures, the same hierarchical architecture, the same kind of bureaucracy, to handcuff the same privileges of power, to try and make up for years of historical deprivation in the exercise of coercive power, to create new and ever more lucrative rent-seeking opportunities, by expanding the role of the government to control and dominate. There are staff cars with flashing beacons, personal security staff jumping up and around everyone, liveried minions going and scraping palatial bungalows which give even the lowliest of government people delusions of grandeur. These are temptations which are very difficult to resist. So unless a huge effort is made to start out with a completely different work culture, these privileges will very quickly take over and begin to be seen as natural benefits of coming into power. So I would feel that this danger for the new state of Telangana is very, very real. Let me be very clear. The slide into rent-seeking behavior is astonishingly rapid. It will also be very clear that the opportunity for charting a new course comes only once. Telangana will not get this opportunity again. The opportunity to build great institutions, create new structures which are non-hierarchical, collegial and participatory and democratic, to design processes which are transparent and which have inbuilt mechanisms for accountability. This is a task which has to be done now, and a massive exercise started of having public consultations and inviting stakeholder participation in prefiguring the future, in preparing a blueprint and a framework document, in rewriting a script of which the people and not government officials or ministers or party bosses will be the authors. This is the political challenge for all those who have spent their lives fighting for Telangana. Because as the visible experience of the AAP party in Delhi has shown, a protest movement cannot be converted into a vision and institution building exercise so easily. Shifting gears requires extraordinary skills, requires constant two-way communication, and requires inspirational leadership. The task before all of you is to initiate such an exercise, not as a government initiative, but as one led by citizens, by civil society groups, by academics and activists, workers' unions, entrepreneurs, corporates and business houses. It should be the most extensive such exercise ever undertaken ever since the writing of the Indian Constitution.